Hi everybody, my name is Cameron King, and today we're going to be looking at variation and evolution, specifically natural selection, the theories of evolution, selective breeding, genetic engineering, and cloning. So let's start by going over the types of variation. So we start out with genetic variation. That is obviously done through your meiotic processes. Okay, so the creation of the gametes are going to lead to genetic variation as we have crossover between the chromosomes. Then we're going to have our environmental variation. Okay, now this is due obviously to the surroundings of the animal. This can include stuff like scars or biocoats. Biocoats are things like sloths. Okay, sloths move so slowly that algae is going to grow on their coats, and they have a little ecosystem in their coats, and this allows them to be more camouflaged as well, so we call that a biocoat. Okay, and yeah, so most traits are going to be a combination between the environment and your genetics. Okay, so something like skin color, okay, will depend on how much sun you get as well as how much melanin you have, you see. So different types of variation to one trait. Then we have natural selection. So natural selection, organisms are going to undergo random mutations, okay, throughout their evolutionary period. And I say organisms, I'm talking about species rather. Okay, so random mutations are going to give them advantageous or disadvantageous traits. Okay, now if it's disadvantageous, the organism is going to die very soon. This is like albinism in your herbivores, let's say. Okay, they stick out a lot more and they're going to be more targeted by predators. Whereas something like having more muscles, okay, or something like having there's some advantageous traits out there, like possibly being more colorful as a bird. Okay, this will all lead to that bird or that animal dominating the mating game, okay, or making it easier for them to find a mate, and therefore their genes are going to spread, okay, and that mutation is going to spread. This is called natural selection, okay. It means they were either going to be killed off very soon in their lives, or they are going to breed more, okay. Okay, so what is the theory of evolution? Basically that all species of living things evolved from simple life forms, okay, that first developed over 3 billion years ago. Now these simple life forms were going to, through natural selection and these random mutations, adapt to their environment, okay, and become more suited for the environment. They then spread out into new environments where they adapted further, and they adapted again due to natural selection and mutations, okay, and as they adapted they became more and more different from one another as they didn't crossbreed, okay, due to geographical restrictions or even differences in their behavior, okay. So as they diversified, they slowly became more and more different, and eventually they become new species, okay, separate species, species that cannot mate, okay. And if they still can mate, even though they're different species, then their offspring are going to be infertile because they will have different numbers of chromosomes, and the offspring will not have a even number of chromosomes. Okay, this is like the mule and the liger. Okay, so selective breeding. Selective breeding is basically when humans try to play God. Okay, so instead of nature selecting individuals with a certain trait that will benefit those individuals in their environment, okay, and culling and killing off those individuals that have a disadvantageous trait, humans are now taking on that role and saying which trait is advantageous for you, okay. It is not always advantageous for the individual though, rather for the human that is trying to breed them. An example of this is dog breeds. Okay, in nature it would be a very big disadvantage if a pug, a pug or a British bulldog or a Chihuahua or something like a Great Dane, okay, would be a very big disadvantage to that species if something like that were to come about through a random mutation, okay? But all those species, those breeds of dogs, have certain traits that we want. So it's advantageous for their species to have those traits. And of course, we're the ones that are going to selectively breed individuals that have those traits. We're going to breed them together so that their offspring have a high chance of having that specific trait. That might not be advantageous in nature, but it's going to be advantageous for us. Okay, now when is this useful? So it can be useful in your farming. Okay, if there is a certain crop that is constantly attacked by a certain pest or a pathogen, we can selectively breed them to be resistant to that pathogen so that we don't have to spray them with insecticides or other types of chemicals. Okay. It's also good if we want to breed them for specific environmental conditions. Okay, let's say we want to breed pets that can survive in certain temperatures. Okay. Another one would be making our fruits tastier, making our food more nutritious, having our animals have more meat. We talked about biomass, or we're going to talk about biomass later on. So it can have a greater effect on our agriculture. We won't have to grow as much to get more nutritious food. Okay, so this is the advantageous parts. The disadvantages and the limits of it is that selectively breeding individuals is going to limit the variation of genes in that pool. Okay, this is also going to lead to inbreeding, which can cause its own very questionable mutations. Okay, because the gene pool is smaller and there's less chance of mutations becoming the new norm, pathogens and disease can wipe out an entire population due to the fact that that hasn't been given a chance to mutate. Okay, and it's also not a guarantee. Okay, if you have done well previously, we did Punnett squares, so you'll see sometimes it's all just a probability that you're going to get an organism with a specific trait, especially if that trait is recessive. Okay, so other than selective breeding, we can use something called genetic engineering, okay, to almost implant a selected gene or a selected trait into another organism. Okay, so this is mainly going to be used for something like hormone production. Okay, the hormones can be something like insulin, let's say, for insulin injections. Okay, now the organism, so initially we take a gene out of our specific DNA. Okay, so we extract that gene using restriction enzymes. They're going to cut the DNA and they're going to cut them in a way that they almost, how can I say this? They have a lip. Okay, so they're not perfectly cut in half like this. Okay, they're cut because it's double-stranded with this gap over here. Okay, now we're then going to use the same restriction enzyme to cut a gap into the plasmid of a bacteria. We call this bacteria a vector. Okay, it's going to carry our new gene and replicate it. Okay, so cutting it with the same restriction enzyme is going to lead to the same ends with the same gap and the same exposed nucleotides, you see, so that when we put them together in the same test tube, our certain gene of interest and the plasmids, okay, when we put them together, they are going to naturally find each other because they're going to have complementary base pairs. You see that? We are then also going to put ligase enzymes in that mix, and they're going to stick those two ends together. Okay, they're going to join that phosphate and sugar bond. Okay. Once we have made our recombinant plasmid, recombinant meaning that it has external genes inside of it, genes that weren't there before. Okay, so we're going to take our recombinant plasmid and we're going to put it into our cell, into our bacterial cell. This bacterial cell is then not only going to process that DNA, okay, and therefore create that hormone, but it's also going to then divide into more bacterial cells that are going to be genetically identical, and they're going to all also create proteins for that specific gene of interest. And this is what genetic engineering is. So like selective breeding, genetic engineering is going to help crops perform better in adverse weather conditions, as well as make them resistant to certain herbicides and pesticides. Okay, so if there is a weed problem, let's say, in your specific crop, okay, there's plants growing around it that you don't want them to grow, what you can do is have a herbicide resistant strain of your crop. So you can spray the entire crop with herbicide, killing all the weeds, but your plant, your specific crop of interest, your plant of interest, is going to survive the herbicide attack. This is obviously not a great idea because, you know, killing an entire ecosystem of plants to save one is not what we're going for. Okay, but we'll get to other ways of dealing with unwanted plants and pests that are a bit more environmentally friendly. Okay, yeah, so other than adverse weather conditions, pest control, as well as your pathogens. Okay, so it can help them be more resistant to pathogens so that you don't get something like potato blight or black rose spot. Okay, we can genetically engineer these crops to be resistant, to create proteins or enzymes that will specifically attack a certain pathogen. Okay. Some examples that increase food security, okay, is going to be that soybeans have been modified to have more protein, so you have to eat less of them to get your daily amount of protein. Rice crops can now survive in flooded conditions. And your potatoes have been modified again to make more starch, to make them more nutritious. Okay, so now we're getting to the cool part, which is cloning. Okay, so a clone is going to be a complete genetic copy of a specific individual. Okay, so this can be for plants as well as animals. Those genetic individuals, those genetic copies are going to have all the traits of the original organism. Okay, 100%. No chance of mutations, no chance of variation, no chance of there being a probability that they get a certain trait. They will have that trait because they are going to be clones. They are going to be copies of it. Okay, this can happen in plant cloning. Okay, so this is when we take a cutting of a plant and we're going to propagate it. Propagating it means you're going to make it grow roots. You see that? So you can take some branches of certain plants, put them in hormones that are going to stimulate root growth, and all of a sudden you have an exact replica of that original plant. If you follow us on TikTok, Fame and Education, Chand and myself are having a bet to see if I can propagate a plant that he neglected. So go have a look at that on TikTok, see how it's going. So yeah, how plants work is you can either take cuttings, or what you can do is take little clumps of cells. Okay, these clumps of cells are then going to be put into nutrient broth, okay, which is going to provide it with all the nutrients it requires, and then they can take bits of that cell clump off, and you can propagate it as many times as you want. As long as it's growing, you can carry on taking little bits, and now all of a sudden you can have thousands and thousands of these individual clones of one plant. Okay, whereas before you might have had to self-pollinate it and then wait for the seeds to grow. now you can have these already not germinated, these exact clones with the full number of chromosomes ready to grow. Okay, because you can stimulate them then again with certain hormones, and they will start rooting and growing leaves and specializing into their own individuals, but individuals that are clones, genetic copies of the original plant. Okay. Now, the same thing can be done with animals. Okay, this is the summary. I'm going to be talking about the next page where I drew a very nice diagram to illustrate this. Okay, so here we have Cameron's cows. I own a cow farm, by the way. And this is how I get clones of an individual animal. Okay, so initially we're going to have two desired parents. Now, these desired parents cost me, the farmer, a lot of money. Okay. Sometimes I don't even own them. Sometimes I have to buy genetic samples from other farmers who own these cows. Okay. So, what would happen is, let's say I own this cow over here. Okay. I own this cow. And she contains a trait that is beneficial for me, of course. Something like a high milk production. Okay. I am then going to buy the sperm sample from a desired male cow. Okay, maybe from another farm, maybe it's my farm. Okay. And I'm going to stimulate the ovulation and the ovulation of an egg cell from this cow. I'm going to take the sperm sample from the bull, and I'm going to, in a test tube, fertilize them together. Okay. As they are fertilized, they have created a zygote. Okay. That zygote, through mitosis, is now going to start dividing into a little clump of cells. What I can then do with this clump of cells is separate it, because these are stem cells. They are unspecialized. They are just plain cells waiting to specialize. So now let's say I split this clump into 3 different sections. Okay. Basically what I've done now is I've created triplets, genetically identical triplet cells. Okay. Or triplet individuals. Okay. Now what I do is I can implant these clumps of cells into surrogates. Now, surrogates are unrelated cows to our original 2 parents. Okay. But their genetics has nothing to do with the implanted zygotes. You see, they are literally just there to give birth and grow this individual. Okay. So these clumps of cells are put into the surrogates. The surrogates it's going to implant into the uterus of the surrogates. And then what's going to happen is it's going to grow into a full individual. It's going to give birth. And all of these individuals are going to be genetic clones of one another. Okay, carrying the traits of the 2 desired parents that had nothing to do with the pregnancy stage of it. You see that? Everything was in vitro, in a lab, and then through surrogates. What this does is it can protect the heifer, they call it, the cow. Okay, so she doesn't have to go through the dangers of birth. Okay, because sometimes pregnancy can kill the animal. Okay. They also don't have to mate, because sometimes they can hurt each other. Sometimes the female will kick the male and injure him or something like that. Okay. And it also allows something like sperm to be sold, okay, on a marketplace, and then have that sperm be delivered across a country or even to another country, okay, to be able to breed that specific cow's genes. Okay, this again could increase our food security. Okay, so instead of transporting an entire cow to a certain farm, we can just sell their sperm, okay, or sell the eggs. So some of the advantages of animal cloning is, again, increases birth rate significantly. So you can have 30 calves a year as you're going to split that little clump into different surrogates, as opposed to maybe 8 cows in a lifetime. Okay. It's also going to have high quality embryos, can be transported, as I said, globally, effective production in areas where cattle production is poor. Okay. So, the ethics behind this genetic engineering. Okay, so some of the benefits that it can have is that we can treat individuals for their disorders before they are born. Okay. It can also be used to cure diseases. Okay. So that a person doesn't have to live a life of taking medication, let's say. Okay, because that can be very expensive for the economy as well as the person. It can also improve the growth rates of plants and animals, as well as increase the value of food as more crops with bigger yield. This is also in animals as well. Now, the disadvantages is that it's uncertain long-term effects. Okay, so especially with cloning, we haven't really supposedly managed to grow a clone to adulthood and have it die of old age. For some reason, these clones always have some birth defects, or they always have they become sick within 3 months or something like that. Okay, so there are uncertain long-term effects when it comes to cloning, in animals anyway. The effects on human health, we obviously, supposedly, hopefully, haven't tried it on humans yet. Okay, so we haven't tried cloning humans because we don't know how it's going to affect that person. It could affect the wildflowers and insects. Okay, so genetically modifying organisms that may not be adapted to an environment could mess up the environment around them. Okay, it's also very expensive. Okay, to do these experiments, different to dopamine in poor regions. I don't think it's meant to say dopamine, but anyway, I've recorded too long of this video. And the ethical management, again, so when it comes to ethics, a lot of the time it's religious beliefs, and it's going to encourage humans to start changing the genetics of their children and to change our own genetics. Okay, we already breed animals that suffer from major health issues for our own benefit. Okay, let's say Dalmatians, they have spots. Great. They also have cancer. Almost 90% of Dalmatians die of cancer in their lives. Great Danes, okay, they're big, that's great, but also a large majority of them have hip dysplasia and they're in pain for the last couple of years of their lives because they can't walk, because they're too big. You see that? So it is important to know that with genetic modification and selective breeding, it can help us to an extent, but if we take it too far, it can damage not only the environment but the species itself. Okay, and then inadvertently it could damage us. Okay, my name is Cameron. This has been Genetics and Variation, and I'll see you in the next lesson.